Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of 25 young adult fantasy standalones. I recently did a video for adult fantasy standalones also with 25, and I wanted to do the same thing for some young adult. I am not going to go super in depth with any of these. I'm just going to kind of do an overview of all of them just so I can get through them quickly. So without further ado, jumping right into it. First set of books would be by Margaret Rogerson. We have An Enchantment of Ravens, Sorcery of Thorns, and Vespertine. An Enchantment of Ravens is a super cute fae love story. We follow a girl who is an exceptional painter, and she has caught the attention of the fae because of this amazing gift she has, and she often will do portraits and paint for them. And there is one very important fae who wants to have his portrait done, and in the time that it takes her to paint him, they get to know one another, they grow very close, and she draws a lot of emotion into his portrait. But when his portrait is revealed to the fae court, they see this expression in him. They see this vulnerability through his emotions, and now it's called into question whether he is fit to rule, and he thinks that perhaps she is trying to sabotage his rule, and so he brings her into the Fae lands to explain herself. It's very whimsical, it's very fairy tale like, and the writing is so beautiful. It's a quick, fun, cute little story, perfect for the fall. After that, we have Sorcery of Thorns. This one follows a young girl who works for a magical library that is filled with grimoires, and it's very important that these are well protected because these have the ability to become essentially monsters if the right circumstances come into play. And our main character has this dream of becoming what is essentially a guard or a knight of these grimoires. But then something happens where one of them gets loose and it wreaks havoc, and she is blamed for this event. And now she is going on the run. She is blameless. However, a lot of people not only believe that she is responsible, but it seems as if somebody has even maybe set her up, or there's some kind of foul play going on. And so not only is she trying to keep herself protected, but she's also trying to look into what occurred a little bit more in depth. After that, we have Vespertine. I went ahead and grabbed another copy I have because this is likely the cover that you've seen. Our main character in this one is named Artemisia, and she is training to become a nun or a Grey Sister whose job it is to keep the dead dead. There are spirits that can be a result of the bodies not being cleansed properly, and so it's her job, and she is training to try and ensure that these spirits do not stay and become dangerous. One day, the convent that Artemisia is living within is attacked, and she has to call upon the power of a relic. This ancient relic has the ability to become very evil if it consumes Artemisia, so there's this now balance between using the relic's power while also not letting it possess her. And you have this almost, it's not quite animal companion, but you have this companion aspect to this story, and it's just really interesting to see how Artemisia has to find this balance. And throughout the story, you're seeing that perhaps the attack was not as random as you might have expected. Maybe there is this evil that is currently coming forward within the world, and now it might be up to Artemisia and the relic to stop it. After that, we have Little Thieves. This is a Goose Girl retelling, but it follows the perspective of the villain in that story. So the villain in this case, or Vanja is her name, she wants to forge a path for herself. However, this is a world that has a lot of issues when it comes to class, where you come from. If you don't have a name for yourself, you don't already have status. And so our main character decides she is going to steal this particular item, this necklace, that gives her the ability to disguise herself as someone else. And in doing this, she's going to rob the nobles while pretending to be a noble herself. However, some of her acts have resulted in a curse being placed on her, and she can only have the curse lifted if she rights her wrongs. She doesn't quite know how to do that, especially as she is currently still in the process of stealing from other nobles. But there's a lot to do with the fact that some of these nobles, it very much seems like, maybe don't need all of this wealth, and maybe there are other people who could use a little bit more of what they have, and these discrepancies between the classes. There's a lot of unfairness, and so that's kind of something that comes up a lot throughout the story. And then on top of all of that, Vanja has to come to terms with who she has stepped on to get to where she is, as well as another character who is investigating a lot of these thefts. Next up, we have Gallant by Ve Schwab. This one, while it is categorized as young adult, I also think this could fall easily into middle grade. However, it is quite scary and dark, so it would definitely be the upper end of middle grade. But this one is almost more horror than it is fantasy. We follow a young girl who does not have the ability to speak, and she is currently living in an orphanage. One day, what seems to be long-lost family has decided to adopt her, but then when she arrives to this very interesting house, it would seem that nobody there knows who she is, and the person that supposedly said that she's long-lost family is not there. And this house also seems to have a lot of secrets and a lot of very dark, eerie elements. So I actually really quite enjoyed this one for, I guess you could call it the aesthetic, the tone, the feel of it. It's definitely not a story where you're going to feel super connected to the main character necessarily, but I do think if you're looking for a fun, quick read for especially Halloween or the fall, this one would be perfect for that. After that, we have 2 books by Tricia Levenseller. They could not be more unalike. We have Warrior of the Wild and The Shadows Between Us. So Warrior of the Wild is cute and precious and adorable, and then The Shadows Between Us is wicked and very over the top and fun. And they're both a very good time, but for very different reasons. So Warrior of the Wild follows a young girl who is living in what is almost like a Viking-inspired village. And within this village, she has to prove herself when she reaches a certain age within these trials of sorts. If she does not succeed, she will be cast out into the wilderness, and she cannot come back to her village unless she accomplishes what is essentially an impossible task that has been given to her. And due to some circumstances completely outside of her control, she ends up being banished from her village, and now she is stranded in the wilderness. And there are 2 other individuals who are also in the wilderness that have been kicked out of their villages, and so our main character is determined to work together, to band together with these 2 other people so they can help each other accomplish their tasks. The Shadows Between Us is not cute, but it is funny, and it is very over the top and entertaining. So in this one, we follow a woman who she decides she is going to try and seduce a man who holds a lot of power, and then once he has accepted her as his bride, she will kill him and then just take all of his wealth and power for herself. But it turns out she has potentially met her match in this man, as he seems rather wicked himself. Next up, we have what is sort of a fantasy murder mystery, and that would be Long May She Reign. So this story follows a young girl who is, I believe, 23rd in line for the throne, and so as a result, she never expects that she will have to worry about that. She's very invested in math and science, and she really enjoys having the time to explore her passion. However, something happens that completely wipes out all of the people that are in line for the throne before her, and suddenly she finds she is in power, and on top of that, beyond just not being prepared for this, there's also the possibility that someone then wants to murder her as well. Next up, we have 2 books by Aaron A. Craig. That would be Small Favors and House of Salt and Sorrows. House of Salt and Sorrows is a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. We follow a young girl who has her whole family essentially is filled with women, and there seems to be this curse placed upon them because so many of her sisters have died, and it seems like this cycle is continuing. This one is very atmospheric. They live in this manor by the sea, and our main character is discovering very eerie, creepy things starting to happen, and it gets quite frightening. It is very tropey, I will say, but it is so much fun, and definitely a great one for if you just kind of want to creep yourself out. Small Favors is also creepy. This one I would say is a little bit more mature. This one for me, I found it's the little things. The other one is very obviously creepy, and then this one is like all these tiny things keep happening, and it's sort of a slow build, but you're constantly like, what the heck is going on? So we follow this girl who lives in a very small town, village, where basically everybody knows each other. You kind of have to trade with one another, and they are beekeepers. They live on a farm as well as a lot of other people around them, and really strange things start to happen. There's a group of people in their village who left to try and bring supplies back before the winter, and those people seem to have been brutally killed, but by what? Nobody's really sure. It almost seems like they were killed by an animal, but people don't really know. And so our main character, some people in her family decide they're going to go see if they can figure out what has happened and then also potentially bring the supplies back that they need. But then they seem to have witnessed some strange things, and they come back and they don't seem like their normal selves. And because it's a small town, you hear little bits of gossip and you hear little things that are happening and you're like, is that true? Or is that just somebody spreading a rumor? And then our main character's little sister will be like, oh, I was talking to so-and-so, and you're like, that person doesn't exist. What is she talking about? Also, a fantasy horror story, we have House of Holo. This follows 3 sisters. We have one main character, though, that we get the perspective of throughout the story, and she is the youngest of her 3 sisters. When they were very, very young, they went missing, and then one day they came back about a month later, and they live within our own world. When this happened, it became this worldwide phenomenon. Nobody knows what happened to them. None of them seem to remember what happened to them, but how they came back, they were covered in blood, but nobody knows whose blood it was or what the blood came from. So it was very scary and very creepy, and as a result, the world is sort of obsessed with what happened to these 3 girls when they were young. And now it would seem that there's something that seems to be coming back for them now that a certain amount of years have passed. Next up, we have Descendant of the Crane and the Ones We're Meant to Find, both by the same author, but quite different. So Descendant of the Crane follows a young girl who isn't all that eager to rule, but her father, who is the leader, ends up dying, and then now she is thrust into this position of power. But she believes that her father was murdered. Nobody else really seems to think he was. And on top of that, those individuals that are within her court, they all seem eager to try and take advantage of her father's death and the instability of the kingdom. The Ones We're Meant to Find is honestly more sci-fi, but I wanted to include it just because I think this author deserves more recognition, so I wanted to mention her in this. So this follows these 2 sisters, one who it seems is stranded on an island, and the other who believes that her sister has died, but is still determined to find her. And we are very much in the future. So our world has now been affected by extreme catastrophes and natural disasters. You see the more well-off individuals living off the ground, essentially, while the poorer classes or people who contributed more to climate change, essentially, are living still on land. And so there's a lot of really interesting dystopian aspects to this story. And within all of that, you have these 2 sisters trying to get back to one another. Next up, we have Lost in the Neverwoods. This is a Peter Pan retelling. Our main character, Wendy, is a young girl who is living within our own world. And Peter Pan is not this fictional character the rest of the world is very familiar with. He instead is a fictional character that her mother has, it would seem, created in telling stories to Wendy when she was growing up and to Wendy's brothers. When Wendy was young, her 2 young brothers went missing. She went missing as well, but she came back, and her young brothers did not. And so it would seem that they have died. They were never found, and this has ripped their family apart, as you would expect. And then one day, this fictional person, it would seem, has shown up, this Peter Pan. And Wendy thinks there's a chance that Peter Pan knows what happened to her 2 missing brothers. It has some interesting scenes and pacing things throughout, but the last chunk of the book was so incredibly moving and emotional that I still highly recommend this. However, it is very difficult. The emotions, I mean, it just hits really hard at the end. Next up, we have a contemporary fantasy called Wicked Fox. This is inspired by Korean folklore, and it follows a young girl who is part nine-tailed fox, and she survives by consuming the life force of men. She tries really hard to only consume the life force of men who have committed terrible acts. However, her half nine-tailed fox side of her, because she is also half human, is discovered by a young human boy at one point, and in the process of this, she ends up losing this bead that is very significant to her survival. And so now she's trying to get that back while also trying to make sure that this young innocent boy, she doesn't have to kill him as a result of him knowing what she actually is. This one has a lot more emotional moments than I was expecting. It sounds very fun. It sounds like it's just going to be like this very there's a lot of tension between the characters and things like that, but actually the characters have a lot of very sweet moments, and it's actually sort of the family ties that is where some of the heavier stuff kicks in, and I was really surprised by this one. There is a companion story that is written after that follows some other characters, but this one definitely stands on its own, and it is very satisfactory in its conclusion. Next two are a couple of fairy tale retellings. One of them is a villain origin story, and one of them takes what is typically a nicer story, but it makes it a little bit more wicked. So that one would be To Kill a Kingdom, which is essentially a dark Little Mermaid retelling. So we have a young man who is constantly out at sea, and then we have a girl who is a mermaid or a siren, and she is tasked with claiming the hearts of men. And so it sounds kind of similar to Wicked Fox in some ways, but she now needs to claim one more heart, and she's trying to claim that of our other main character. Then with Heartless, we follow the origin story of the Queen of Hearts. This one, our main character is just this really sweet girl. She wants us to have her own bakery, and she loves to bake. And with this main character, you see her trying her best to just keep to herself, to just enjoy what she enjoys, and try not to get too involved in things. She's very bad at sticking up for herself, and as a result, some terrible things occur, especially when it comes to this blooming romance between her and this jester. After that, we have Wicked Deep. This is another one that is fantastic for the fall, as it is more horror inspired. So we follow this particular area within our own world. It takes place in the US, and it takes place along the western coast. And we have this strange phenomenon where every year there are supposedly the souls of these women who were killed years ago during these witch hunts. These women now try to lure young men out into the sea. Speaking of things being lured out to the sea, next up we have The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. So this is a retelling, and we follow a young girl who, her brother is in love with this young woman who is meant to be sacrificed to their sea god. And this village that they are from consistently sacrifices a young woman in the hopes that she will be a bride that will help calm the sea god and therefore stop the natural disasters and catastrophes that are plaguing them. But thus far, the sea god has not been satisfied with their sacrifices, and our main character does not want her brother to have to lose the woman he's in love with, so she goes in that woman's place. And once she gets there, she discovers there's so much more to the spirit world, to the sea god, and to everything that is going on than she could have ever imagined. After that, we have The Kingdom of Back. This is one that I almost sometimes am not sure whether I should consider this fantasy or not, but it is definitely somewhat magical realism. So this follows Nannerl Mozart, which would be Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's sister. It was a real person who existed in history, and she was just as talented, if not more so, than her brother. However, because of the restrictions placed on women in that time period, she was never really able to be appreciated for her talent the same way that her brother was. And so this story, Marie Lu actually takes this real thing that these two siblings did. So when the Mozart siblings were going from place to place, they, to entertain themselves, were making up this make-believe land called the Kingdom of Back that they were the king and queen of. So Marie Lu took that idea, and then she made this, what feels like this real fantasy world that these two go to, where it's somewhat like a dark fae-inspired world. But this is where I say it kind of has this magical realism factor, because it very much is unclear whether some of the things transpiring are actually happening or if this is all within a child's imagination. Next up, we have The Nameless Queen. This one I think is fantastic for if somebody is transitioning out of middle grade and into young adult. We follow a young girl who is part of a group of people that are considered nameless, so they don't really have anywhere close to the same amount of privileges that the rest of society has. And when the king of their land dies, there's this tattoo that is supposed to signal who the next ruler will be. And our main character suddenly gets this despite the fact that she herself is nameless and therefore should have never at any point have been considered, because they don't even know how she could possibly be named ruler when she is nameless herself. After that, we have Alatsue. This one is essentially a murder mystery and has a lot of Native American folklore tied into it. Similar to Nameless Queen, I think this one is fantastic for somebody transitioning out of middle grade. While there is a murder mystery occurring, I do think that the tone feels somewhat young, but the themes feel very mature. And you have a lot that has to do with the fact that there has been mistreatment of Native Americans within the US over time, continues to occur. So you see a lot of those things happening. And our main character, a lot of the magic that she utilizes in trying to solve this murder is tied to these beliefs. After that, we have girl Serpent Thorne. This follows a young girl who anybody she touches will die. So she has this poisonous touch, and she meets somebody who seems to potentially have the knowledge that will cure her of this curse. But then there is another individual who feels that this is not a curse at all, but this is actually a strength, and they don't feel that she should make any attempts to try and change this about her. This one individual is somebody who is a guard. She thinks that they are on her side. And the other person who might have answers is somebody who is within a prison and very much seems like they are the enemy. Next up, we have Jade Fire Gold. I do want to say, while this one is currently a standalone, there is a scene at the very end of the story that makes me think that perhaps we will eventually get another one. But this one has a fantastic, very short synopsis that I think does a better job than I would of explaining it. It says, in an empire on the brink of war, On is no one with no past and no family. Alton is a lost heir, his future stolen away as a child. When they meet, Alton sees in On a path to reclaiming the throne. On sees a way to finally unlock her past and understand her lethal magical abilities, but they may have to pay a far deadlier price than either could have imagined. So you do have the lost heir trope, for those of you that are a fan of that. And I will say there is, to some degree, a little bit of an enemies to lovers within this as well. The last one, I think, in calling it fantasy, it does somewhat contribute to some reveals in the book, because I think otherwise you would think it's historical fiction, and the fantasy elements sort of kind of only come into play at the very end. So I'm not actually even going to put up the image of the book on the screen. For those of you that don't care about it being called fantasy and potentially having some reveals exposed, then you can keep watching. But if you're nervous for us to what that even means, I'll go ahead and put a timestamp and you can just skip ahead. But anyway, the book would be Anatomy, a Love Story. So this very much seems like a historical fiction where you follow a young girl from a wealthy family who really wants to become a surgeon. Because it is historical fiction and because of the particular time period, the main character is not somebody who typically would be allowed to become a surgeon or would be respected as one because she is a girl. And so she is given the opportunity to maybe try and take a test, and whether or not she passes this test will mean so much for girls who come after her. So it's very important to her that she gets all of the education she can. However, she is held back from gaining that education because of the restrictions placed on girls. So her solution to this is she's going to, it sounds very dark, and it is pretty morbid, but at this time, there were people that used to dig up bodies, and then they would give them to people who were doctors so that those doctors could then try and do autopsies and try to study on these bodies, and they would pay these individuals. And so she, because she is wealthy and comes from a lot of money, decides, well, I'm just going to go ahead and do this, and this will allow me to study because I'm not able to study otherwise. So far you can see how, like, what fantasy elements are there possibly, and I can't say, but there are some, and that's it. That's all I'll say. That's it for some young adult standalones. If you have any more that you would like to add, definitely feel free to do that in the comment section down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.